So much for being here. Dan, when it comes down to it and we talk about addiction, it's more than just alcohol. We live in an addicted society. How do you make a dent when so many people are drowned in this word?
Well, that's a great point. I mean, addiction really is so much more than alcohol and other drugs, and I mean, it's a huge piece. One woman, Dr. Stephanie Covington, says that addiction is a chronic neglect of self in favor of someone or something else. And when you think of that, that covers a lot of territory. But, I think we do it the way that we do so many other huge social issues. We've got treatment centers set up all over the country, and part of what I'm doing is really working with them to provide the most effective services to the men that are coming into the treatment centers. So, at least that's a piece of it, is the men that are already in recovery and the men that we're able to engage and get into various treatment programs and mental health services. That's a huge piece of my population that I'm targeting and that I'm reaching.
Is there a difference between a man's addiction and a woman's addiction? Are they treated differently? Does it come about for a different reason, even though I know the effect is the same? What's the difference between both modalities?
Well, I think they definitely come about for a different reason. I mean, growing up and becoming a man are absolutely almost synonymous with drinking. One of the first quotes in my book is from a pastor who's in recovery, who was a pretty tough guy when he was younger, and he said, when I was growing up, I learned two things about being a man. The first, I learned how to fight, and the second, I learned how to drink.
Yeah.
And I think that speaks a lot to how embedded alcohol is in how men are raised. You don't have that same thing with women. We know that men are 5 times more likely to develop substance dependence than women. Some of it is because of the high-risk lifestyle. Some of it is due to at least what seems to be greater genetic vulnerability, although we're still learning more about that. But it's not just the addiction piece. In fact, probably more important is the recovery piece. In other words, once we've identified the addiction and somebody has kind of come to grips with the fact that they're addicted, how do we help them move toward a trajectory of recovery and to put that addiction into remission? Once we get men in a space where they are willing to say, okay, I've got an addiction, now how do I do something about it? Part of, a core part of my work is addressing the dichotomy between these so-called rules for being a man that so many men, all men really, are living with to varying degrees, and then the expectations for treatment and recovery. And to give you a quick example, when you think of how men are raised and you think of some of the rules for being a man, it's what? Don't show feelings, don't cry, don't be vulnerable, don't ask for help, be strong, be a protector, be a provider, always be in control, fix everything. Like, those are expectations that we seem to have almost across cultures for men. Then they come into a program, a treatment program, they come into this new way of living, and we tell them what? Be vulnerable, share your feelings, ask for help, let go of control. Strength isn't everything. You don't know everything. You got to ask for help. You got to, allow yourself to be weak. You have to admit that you're powerless. And that incredible dichotomy is it's so strong and so powerful, yet it's so rarely ever recognized in the treatment process.
Dan, let's talk about the word weakness for a moment. And I think there's the power. Being physically strong, going out and fighting, drinking and all that, whatever. But the point of contention is, do you know how strong, rhetorically, do you know how strong you have to be weak? Do you know how strong you have to be vulnerable? And all of those things that you're talking about, that takes some heavy-duty strength.
And those of us who know that, get that. And I totally agree with you. I mean, that is some of the most difficult, challenging work that a man or a woman, can do, because it hits at the core of our humanity. And, it's absolutely huge. But until a man now allows himself to go there, that is still viewed as weak. I mean, until you've had experience with it,
Sure.
It's so easy to dismiss as weak because our culture dismisses it as weak. And, particularly for men, we might be more okay with it for women, but certainly not for men.
How many people out there don't know that they're addicted?
Oh, my gosh. Well, that's a whole nother 5 shows.
Sure.
I mean, we know about, at best, 20% of the people that could benefit from treatment end up in treatment every year. About 10% of the population, around 10 to 12% of the population, they estimate, has some kind of alcohol or other drug dependence. One of the biggest barriers, a lot of the times, are all the peoples in the addict's life who are protecting them from their consequences, who are covering up for them, who are, not wanting to admit that that's what's happening, is that it's an addiction. And that's something that enables the person with the addiction to continue to deny to themselves the reality of what's happening. The work that I'm doing is to help men get there sooner, in the sense of accepting that they have an addiction, but then also being able to establish a foundation for their recovery that enables them to really move into a healthy life. One of the phenomena that we see with a lot of men in recovery is because these rules that I mentioned to you earlier, they're so deeply embedded inside of men that men get sober, they get into recovery, and they still find at 3 years or 5 years or 10 years of sobriety, they're really still struggling with the relationships, or they're really struggling with maybe other addictions, or they're struggling with just feeling any kind of peace. And a lot of it has to do with them still getting caught up in, I can't be too vulnerable, or I can't admit that I don't know this, or I don't want to look too weak in front of these other men in the meetings that I attend. And that's been a very powerful response from the men in the recovery communities around the country and even the world to the work that I'm doing, is they feel a piece is missing. And the biggest piece that we've really not been talking about with men and addictions is trauma, and really understanding how trauma affects men differently than it does women. For a long time, they would say, you stop growing emotionally when you start using. And for the longest time, we had some sense about that. But now we have the actual neurochemical, neurobiological evidence that shows that to be true, given the areas of the brain that are affected by chronic alcohol or other drug use, the neurotransmitters, the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system. All of those are areas that greatly affect judgment, fight or flight, our ability to make decisions, our ability to think abstractly, the kind of moral reasoning, the thing that separates us from other animals, is deeply affected by chronic use of alcohol and other drugs. And it's affected, quite honestly, just by the use of alcohol or drugs, period. But using it over and over, you literally get to see how the brain adapts to having those chemicals in there. And so you do see exactly what you're talking about. And that's why it's so important that when a man gets into recovery, it really is a process. It's a discovery of becoming a man.
Sure.
And really embracing what it means to be a healthy man and a man who can stay sober. And a man who can stay sober is the one who's going to be able to acknowledge when he feels hurt or vulnerable, because to do otherwise could lead him toward anger or doing something else that he regrets, or just creates a lot of stress in his life. And stress is the primary factor, primary reason for relapse.
Sure.
For people with addiction.